The norther had come in from the caprock like a slow white animal, rubbing its cold flank along the llano until the grasses lay one way, and the pond took on the color of hammered tin. Wind combed the needle grass and sent the smell of cedar through the fence lines. It rattled the stovepipe and rattled the nerves of anything with blood. Calder Rook stepped out at daybreak, boots whitening with frost, and studied the sky the way a man reads a ledger he already knows is against him. The house behind him was square-shouldered and quiet, all its doors closing soft, as though the wood itself had learned to lower its voice. He did not hurry. Inside, the rooms remembered. They held the stillness of boiled lye and line-dried cotton, and a lavender that had outlived the hands that shook it. Calder touched the back of a chair with 2 fingers, as if it might step away. In the bedroom, the top drawer caught the way it always had, a little rasp of wood on wood, and he eased it open to the neat geography of folded handkerchiefs and cancelled letters. There lay the dented matchbox, nickel dull, corners mashed, the hinge complaining softly when it opened. Within, cupped like a tiny moon, lay a mother-of-pearl button split by a hairline crack. Light ran through that seam like water through chalk. He closed his fist around the tin. Outside town, Lena Malloy walked a ridge road that carried dust as if it were an old song. She had a thread tin and a folded measuring tape in the pocket of her coat, and the certainty of work in her stride, though the work itself was never certain. The north wind pressed her skirt against her legs and brought tears as clean as well water to her eyes. She counted fence posts for company, named each in her head to keep the pace even, and when the wind dropped a little, she hummed to fill what the land did not say back. She kept to herself. The talk in Stead's Mercantile had put no hook in her. She rented a narrow back room above the blacksmith's, where heat rose slow and soot lived in the curtains, and there at night she unrolled the old pedal machine she had traded for in Abilene, the iron so heavy it made a man curse to lift it. The treadle took her foot like a stubborn horse, but once moving it went smooth, and she stitched other people's lives together by lamplight, hem by hem, tear by tear, her work quieting the hour the way snow quiets a yard. She did not stitch for herself. Calder set the matchbox on the bureau and watched the crack in the shell shine and dim as the morning moved. He remembered how the button had let go the day fever found the house, how it had pinged across the floor and disappeared into dust, and how he had found it weeks later in the broom bristle, a small brightness in the dull. He had carried it ever since, as if it might yet close what had opened in him, as if the seam across the pearl could be pressed shut by a man's thumb. It could not. The Rook place sat blue in the cold. Boards creaked in the porch like old men shifting. In the shed, a saddle blanket waited with its split seam showing like a thin smile that meant nothing good. A branding rope lay in a coil the color of old straw. Calder looked once at the north lot, where the wind had pushed cattle into a huddle that breathed like a single animal. He could not stay out there long. He went back in. He made coffee strong enough to bully the morning and set 2 cups on the table without thinking who the second might be for. Steam lifted and unstitched itself in the cold. The kitchen window showed the yard like the memory of a photograph, edges bleached, the lines of the world briefly sure and then not. He turned the cup so the chip in the rim faced away. He waited for nothing and for something. On the far side of the section, Lena reached the gap in the fence where a storm had argued with Cottonwood and won. A shred of blue calico hung from the wire as if the sky had torn a little and left a piece behind. She stood there with the cloth between finger and thumb, reading the stitch, the way a careful woman reads another's handwriting for the tremor that tells more than the words. Then she folded the scrap small and put it in her pocket as gently as a favor. The tune she hummed found its breath again. By noon the sun shone like a blade laid flat. No edge, only glare. Calder carried a bundle of shirts to the porch rail by habit, shirts that had kept their silence through dust and sweat, and a season of not speaking aloud certain names. He had written a note to be left at Stead's if anyone asked for work with a machine. He turned the paper over twice and left it blank. There are kinds of wanting that a man cannot bring to the counter. He shut the door softly. Toward evening, the norther leaned harder and the land leaned with it. At the Rook place, the wash line ran from porch post to a cedar trunk scarred by lightning years back, and the clothespins clicked like teeth. Calder stood there with the matchbox warming to his palm and felt the threadbare place where a hand might have gone into his. He did not say the wife's name. He said nothing at all. Silence had become his grammar. On the road, the seamstress walked with her coat held close, a woman alone on a ledger line between towns, and the light went pewter and then black. When she rounded the last turn, the ranch house stood up out of the wind like something that had decided to hold. The windows made their small squares of mercy. She paused long enough to smooth the hair the wind had taken, and then she went to the porch and knocked as one does upon a church door, twice, and then once again, smaller. A hinge answered before a voice did. Calder opened the door against the wind and saw her there, a small figure wrapped in a coat too thin for the hour, her hair half undone and glinting like candle smoke. For a moment he thought she'd come to sell Bibles or trouble. Then she spoke his name quiet, as if afraid the syllables might break. "Mr. Rook, they said you needed mending done." He nodded once, slow. The storm rattled the eaves. Behind him, the house seemed to hold its breath. She stepped into a room that smelled of cedar and starch. Dust hung in the air like something waiting to land. On the table, he'd laid a folded stack of shirts, the fabric stiff from sun and wind. She drew off her gloves, set them beside the lamp, and ran her fingertips along a frayed cuff. "You mend by machine?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Quiet work. If you don't mind the treadle." "I mind most noises less than silence," he said. Her lips curved at that, but she didn't answer. The lamp crackled. While she unpacked her tin of threads, Calder poured 2 cups of coffee, a habit of loneliness he hadn't managed to break. He slid one toward her. She hesitated, then took it in both hands. Steam rose between them, thin and white, as though it might hide the strangeness of 2 people trying not to look at one another too long. "You're welcome to use the washroom table for your work," he said, gesturing down the hall. More light. "I'll keep to myself." "I reckon that's all anyone can promise," he murmured. By afternoon, the rain had gone, leaving only the squeak of the pump and the hush of the plains after weather. Calder rode out to check the north fence. When he returned, the house was humming, low and strange at first, then clearer, almost tender. A woman's hum threading through the boards like something stitched into them. He followed the sound to the washroom. The door stood open. Inside, Lena sat at the machine, the calico dress, his late wife's, spread across her lap. She wasn't wearing it, only smoothing the fabric, tracing the faded seams, humming to herself as if coaxing life from cloth. The dress breathed in the draft from the open window, and for an instant it looked like a ghost remembering its body. He stood there too long. When she turned and saw him, her eyes went wide, and the tune broke in her throat. "Sir, I didn't mean—" He lifted a hand. "It's all right," he said, though he didn't know if it was. It needed air. Her gaze dropped to the fabric, to the place where the missing button had once been. "It's beautiful work," she whispered. "She did every stitch herself," he said. A board creaked behind him, one of the ranch hands passing through the hall. The man's eyes flicked from the seamstress to the dress and back again, quick and sharp, before he ducked out with a muttered apology. Calder knew what that look would become once it reached town. Words travel faster than wind across empty land. By dusk, the lamplight in Stead's Mercantile caught the whisper. Rook's seamstress found singing over the dead woman's dress. A sentence as small as a thorn, carried on the air until everyone had bled on it. That night, Lena folded the calico and set it back where she'd found it, her hands trembling though she didn't know why. She could feel the story already running ahead of her into the dark. Calder sat alone on the porch, coffee gone cold. the matchbox turning in his palm. He thought of the tune she'd hummed, not a morning sound, but something older, something that reached back before sorrow had a name. The wind moved through the porch rail and made the clothespins click. He set the matchbox down beside him and listened to that small, ceaseless rhythm. It sounded, for the first time in years, like company. Morning found the ranch washed clean and shining. The frost had melted from the porch rail, and the world seemed to breathe again, though it was a tired kind of breath. Lena came early, her boots damp from the grass, her hands red from cold and work. She did not hum that morning. She kept her head down and her words shorter than thread. Calder said little too. He left a cup of coffee by her machine without meeting her eyes. She nodded in thanks and set the tin cup aside untouched until the steam had fled. Between them hung a silence not sharp but heavy, like two stones waiting out the same rain. She worked on his shirts, the rhythm of the treadle steady and low, a heartbeat that belonged to someone else. When a sleeve ripped again under the needle, she stopped to knot it by hand. Calder, coming through the room with an armload of feed sacks, paused. "You're sewing too close to the edge," he said softly. "Yes, sir. Doesn't hold as well that way." She smiled without looking up. Some things don't hold either way. He meant to answer but didn't. The machine took up the talk instead. Later she saw him through the window, trying to mend the saddle blanket his wife had once used for Sunday rides. He worked it with coarse twine and stubbornness, his hands too rough for that kind of grace. She hesitated at the doorway, then came out holding her shears. "If you'll let me, sir," she said, "I can fix that seam proper." He frowned. "No need. It's just to cover a horse. Still, it's better done right." He handed it over. Her fingers brushed his glove as she took it, and he felt that brief spark that comes when something forgotten brushes the living again. By sunset, the blanket was whole. She folded it neatly and left it across the stall door, a small act done quietly so no one might call it kindness. Calder found it there after dark, ran a hand over the new stitch, and wondered how something mended could still carry its break inside it. He wanted to thank her, but the words felt too loud for the house. Instead, he left another cup of coffee near her work table at dawn. It waited there until she arrived, still warm. She touched the handle as if it might burn, then sipped once, eyes closing. He watched from the hallway and told himself he was only making sure the stove drew well. In town, the story had already grown a spine. The blacksmith said the widow's dress was back in use. The grocer added that the rancher had paid her in jewelry. By the time it reached the saloon, she was said to sleep under his roof and wear his wife's shoes. Lena heard it in fragments. A glance too long, a whisper half caught in the post office. She bore it the way the plains bear dust. Silent, endless, inevitable. Her only rebellion was to work harder, to leave fewer hours in which her mind could wander to shame. One evening, the pump gave out its first dry gasp. Calder came in from the yard, boots mud-caked, eyes rimmed with the kind of weariness that makes a man look both younger and older. She handed him a towel before he asked, "You ought to rest, Mr. Rook." He shook his head. "The well's low. No rest till it's mended." "You can't mend a well," she said softly. He almost smiled. "Can't sew water either, I suppose?" Her laughter came like something breaking open, quick and bright and gone, before either could look at it too closely. When she left that night, the sky was raw with stars, everyone a nail holding up the dark. Calder watched her walk the trail back to town, the lamp she carried bobbing like a slow heart. He stayed on the porch until the light was swallowed by distance. Then he looked at the matchbox on the railing, thumb brushing the dull metal. The cracked pearl gleamed faintly under the moon. He thought of the woman humming over the calico dress and of the rumor that carried her name like wind carries seed. Careless, unstoppable. He opened the matchbox and listened to its click, that small sound that had always been his prayer. It was not silence. It was almost forgiveness. The wind had turned south again, soft and warm with the smell of rain too far away to reach them. Days stretched thin, pale with dust. Calder worked the herd until dusk and came back to find the house breathing slow, a tired heart still beating. The wash line was drawn tight across the porch, clothespins like tiny bones. And there, moving on the line like a living thing, was the calico dress. He stopped on the steps. The skirt swayed in the fading light, gathering color from the sunset, faint pinks and coppers, the memory of another woman's skin. It had been washed clean, dried, and pinned with care. The sight hollowed him out. For a heartbeat, he thought the air itself had put her ghost there to see if he still knew her shape. Then he saw Lena. She was standing a little apart, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hair pinned crookedly, the last clothespin between her teeth. The wind lifted her hair, tangled it across her face. She reached to secure the hem and did not see him. The humming came again, that same low, unfinished tune. He swallowed once, then spoke. "You can let it down," he said. She jumped, the pin dropping from her mouth. "I didn't mean no harm. The trunk was damp. I thought it best to air it." Calder came closer, boots whispering on the boards. "It's all right," he said. "It's been waiting long enough." Her eyes searched his, uncertain. "You sure, sir?" He nodded. "Things can rot even when they're folded careful." The evening light poured gold through the latticework, striping the dress and her face alike. Calder reached into his pocket, brought out the dented matchbox. He hadn't opened it in weeks. The hinge rasped once, and the cracked mother-of-pearl winked like a small star losing patience. He set it on the railing between them. Lena's gaze fell to it, then back to him. "That's hers?" "Yes. It's beautiful. It's broken." She touched the button lightly, a fingertip barely grazing the crack. "Maybe both," she said. He let out a slow breath, the kind that carries years in it. "It always clicked when I opened it, sounded like a cricket at night. Kept me company longer than I care to admit." From down by the barn came the sound of a horse stamping, restless, followed by a man's voice calling something they couldn't catch. Then laughter, not cruel, just thoughtless, and the crunch of boots walking away. Calder's jaw tightened. He knew the shape gossip took before it spoke. Lena gathered the dress from the line, folded it over her arm. "They're talking, aren't they?" she asked quietly. "They talk about weather when they can't think of worse things," he said. She half smiled, but her eyes were damp. "I can work somewhere else." He shook his head. "If I turned away everyone this land whispered about, I'd live with ghosts." Her voice trembled. "Maybe you already do." He looked at her then properly, as though the question required his whole attention. "Maybe I do," he said. "But tonight, they can wait." She nodded once and carried the dress inside. The lamplight followed her, soft as breath. Calder stayed on the porch, fingers tracing the grain of the rail beside the matchbox. The wind pushed a last dry gust through the cottonwoods, rattling seed pods like bones in a rattle. When he finally picked up the matchbox, it clicked open again. Small, exact, forgiving. He turned it once in his hand and placed it on the windowsill just inside the kitchen, where its faint gleam caught the light like an old promise reconsidered. Behind him, he heard the rhythmic treadle of the sewing machine begin again, slow, patient, the sound of a wound trying to remember how to close. And for the first time since his wife's passing, the house did not sound empty. It sounded like something mending itself in secret. By mid-June, the wind no longer cooled the skin. It rasped, it scoured. The cattle stood in the far lot with their heads low, tails twitching in slow surrender. The pond cracked around the edges, the color of old pennies. Every nail in the fence seemed to ring when the sun struck it. Calder hauled water from what was left of the well, one bucket, then two, listening for the hollow echo that came when the bottom began to show. He poured each pail as though it might be the last. Dust clung to his boots like guilt. Inside, Lena had drawn the curtains to keep the light from burning the thread she worked with. The sewing machine stood still now. Even the iron felt hot to the touch. She stitched by hand, small, precise movements, needle trembling slightly from the heat that lifted through the floorboards. Her own breath came short. Sometimes she pressed a wet rag to her throat and thought of rain that might never come. She'd seen dry years before, but never one that made her feel as though the whole earth was refusing forgiveness. That evening Calder came in with cracked lips and the look of a man who had spoken to no one but God and got no answer. He set the bucket down by the stove and watched her fold a length of cloth. The calico again, washed, mended, kept hidden for days until now. "Can't dry cloth without water," he said, voice low. "I didn't mean to take it out again," she answered. "I just couldn't stand the dark." He nodded once. There's some things the dark don't deserve. For a long time they listened to the kettle hiss with what little water it had left. Later, when he went to check the well, she followed. The night smelled like dust and fear, like something ending. He dropped the rope and listened, 1, 2, 3, before the faint splash answered. Not deep enough. "Needs digging deeper," he said. "You'll kill yourself in this heat." "Then the well can serve some use." She stepped close enough for him to feel her shadow touch his arm. "You can't mend grief by digging, Mr. Rook." "I can try," he said. Her hand brushed his sleeve, tentative, almost accidental. He did not move away. The next morning the sky turned brass. He went down into the shaft anyway, shoulders scraping dirt, spade ringing on stone. Lena brought him water, but he would not drink. Sweat carved dark tracks through the dust on his face. When the rope creaked above him, he looked up to see her leaning over, hair blown wild, fear plain in her eyes. "Come out," she called. "Please." He obeyed because the word "please" sounded too much like prayer. That night he sat on the porch with his head bowed. The cracked matchbox lay open beside him, the pearl button dull in the lantern light. "She died when the creek ran dry," he said finally, voice gone to gravel. "I thought maybe water'd keep her here. So I built this well." Lena listened, hands folded in her lap. "You built it out of grief," she whispered. "Out of need," he corrected. Then softer, "Maybe there's no difference." She looked at him and saw a man built the same way, hollowed, waiting for something to fill him. A hot wind rose, rattling the window panes. Lena gathered the calico dress in her arms, pressing it against her chest to keep it from falling. She could feel the thread she'd sewn into it pulling, as if the cloth itself strained to breathe. "Maybe we should put it away," she said, "before the house takes fire from the heat." He nodded but did not move. "It's strange," he murmured. "I used to think that dress was her ghost. Now I think it's just cloth, waiting for a hand that still works." "Then let it rest," Lena said. "It's done enough work for one life." Before dawn, thunder rolled somewhere distant, not close enough to see lightning, just a rumor of mercy. Calder rose and went to the porch. The matchbox lay closed again, dew silvering the hinge. He set his hand on it and whispered something that was not quite prayer and not quite goodbye. Inside, Lena slept at the machine, a needle still threaded with red. The house smelled faintly of iron, dust, and hope that had not yet decided whether to return. The morning came yellow and still, a light without weight, the kind that warns before it wounds. A hawk circled above the far pasture, slow and soundless. Calder watched it while he worked the pump handle, but the pump only groaned like an animal too tired to rise. He left the bucket where it was and wiped his palms on his jeans, tasting metal in the air. The wind began with a sigh, then a whistle, then a scream. By noon, the blue norther had crawled down from the hills and onto the flat. The sky split open, swallowing its own light. The cattle bunched against the fence and bawled. Dust turned to rain in the space of a breath. Calder shouted once toward the barn. but the storm took the sound. Inside, Lena was gathering cloth, closing windows, her hair wet against her cheeks. The air smelled of ozone and wet earth and terror. She had pulled the calico dress from the trunk again, intending to keep it safe, and now it hung on the line, thrashing like something alive. When Calder came in from the yard, rain in his eyes, he saw her through the doorway, bent forward, trying to unpin the dress, her skirt plastered to her legs. The storm roared between them, white and cold, wind spraying needles of water. He reached for the rope, but it slipped, the pins broke loose, and the calico was gone, whipped into the gray. Lena turned, empty hands trembling. "It's taken," she said. He shook his head. "Let it go." It was hers. "It's ours now," he said, voice barely a thread over the wind. The thunder rolled close enough to rattle the rafters. Calder grabbed her wrist, pulled her back inside, and slammed the door. Rain struck the glass like pebbles. For a long time they stood against the wood, shoulders touching, breath coming hard. Lena's hair stuck to her mouth. She laughed once, sharp and startled. "You saved me from a ghost," she said. He looked at her, really looked, water running down both their faces, and for a moment he did not know whose tears they were. The storm raged on. Calder found the lamp and set it near the stove. The flame fought for life, flickered, and then steadied. He reached for the matchbox on the shelf and opened it, the cracked pearl catching the light like lightning in miniature. He held it out to her. "She wore that dress the day she took sick," he said. "This fell off when she fainted. I found it later and thought if I kept it, I could keep her." Lena touched the button as if it might still be warm. "Some things come back only when we let them go," she whispered. He nodded once. "Then maybe that's what the storm's for." Outside, the wind tore shingles from the roof. A pane broke somewhere down the hall. The whistle of the open gap rose high and thin. Water ran under the door, puddling at their feet. Calder went to fetch a towel, but Lena was quicker. She ripped a strip from the hem of her own skirt and stuffed it in the crack to stop the whistle. The cloth went dark with water. He watched her work, quiet, sure, her hand steady where his would have shaken. The sight undid something in him that grief had kept tied. For hours the storm kept the house in its mouth. They sat on the floor by the stove, lantern between them. He told her about the dry years, the fever, the funeral without rain. She told him about the husband she'd buried on the road east, the hunger that had followed her like a stray dog. Words came slowly, truth trading places with silence until both were full. By midnight, the thunder began to drift away. The air softened. The lamp's flame bent low and righted itself. Calder rose, went to the window, and opened it a crack. Rain smell poured in, clean, sweet, final. He turned back to her. "Storm's broken," he said. Lena smiled faintly. "Maybe it just moved inside," she whispered. When he stepped onto the porch, the dress was nowhere in sight. Only a single clothespin lay on the boards, cracked in two. He bent and picked it up, holding the pieces together like something that could still be mended. Beyond the yard, the lightning flared once. Pale blue on the horizon, showing the empty line of land where the calico had vanished. He said her name into the wind, not his wife's, but Lena's. And this time, the world didn't take it away. It carried it forward. The next morning arrived raw and white, sky washed clean of anger. The air held that new kind of silence that always follows storms. Not peace yet, but the pause before it begins. Mud darkened the yard, and puddles shone like coins, half buried. The whole ranch smelled of wet iron and turned soil. Calder found Lena asleep at the kitchen table, her head pillowed on folded arms. The lamplight had burned itself out hours ago. The wick was a thin curl of ash. On the floor beside her lay the matchbox, open, the cracked mother-of-pearl button glinting faintly in dawn light. He knelt, picked it up, and for the first time didn't close it. He set it down by her hand, the lid open, like an invitation. When she woke, the sound of his boots on the porch reached her before she saw him. He was outside, mending the hinge of the screen door with wire. His movements were slow, deliberate, a man trying to fix something he'd broken long ago. She stepped to the doorway and watched, not speaking. He looked up finally. "Did you sleep?" "Some." He nodded. Storm took the roof shingles off the north side, not much else. "That's Mercy," she said. He wiped his hands. "Mercy's rare in this county. Easier to find a broken thing than a gentle one." Her eyes softened. "And yet you keep mending both." He smiled, the first small, true smile she'd ever seen on him. "Maybe I don't know how to stop." By mid-morning, the sun came through the windows, strong enough to warm the plank floors. The machine in the washroom sat quiet until she pulled it closer to the light. The needle gleamed, clean but idle. She took up the calico scrap she had rescued from the storm, just a torn hem she'd found caught on the porch rail. When she pressed it flat, the cloth smelled faintly of rain and smoke. Calder stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "You found a piece." "Only this. It's enough," he said. She threaded the needle and began to sew, not because it needed repair, but because the rhythm steadied her hands. The treadle moved under her bare foot, whispering a steady heartbeat into the quiet. After a while she spoke, eyes still on her work. "The song I hummed that day, you remember it?" "I do. My mother sang it when I was little, when storms came or when the men got loud. Said it kept the roof from splitting." He leaned against the door frame. "Seemed to work." She smiled faintly. "It's not a hymn. It's a lullaby. About a woman who kept sewing long after her eyes went bad. Said she'd keep stitching until she saw her child again." Calder's throat tightened. "I used to think you were humming for her." "My wife." "Maybe I was," Lena said softly. "Maybe we both were." He walked over, picked up the small scrap of fabric, and turned it in his fingers. "Funny thing," he murmured. "She was wearing this dress when the fever took her. I thought it was cursed. I wouldn't let the hands touch it, wouldn't let it out in the light. And still, it stayed." Waiting. "Not cursed," Lena said. "Just lonely." He looked at her, and in that look lay the years he'd buried in silence. The dry mornings, the untouched cup, the empty second chair. From outside came the sound of hoofbeats fading toward town, probably a ranch hand or a stray trader. But neither moved to the window. They stayed there, the two of them, in a stillness that felt almost sacred. Calder opened the matchbox, set the cracked pearl on the table. The light from the window found its fracture and turned it silver. "She was dying when that fell loose," he said quietly. "I picked it up off the floor after they took her out. I kept it because it was the last thing in the house that had touched her. I thought if I held it long enough, she might speak through it." Lena traced the seam of the button with her thumb. "Maybe she just waited for you to speak first." He breathed in slow. "Let it go." "Then maybe I just did." Rain dripped from the eaves, the last of the storm emptying itself. In the quiet that followed, the sewing machine stilled. Lena looked up. "What will you do with the dress gone?" He thought a moment. "Maybe I'll stop guarding ghosts. Let the wind keep what it took." "Then what will you keep?" He smiled. Tired, gentle, free. "This." He gestured toward the button. "And the living." When she went to pour fresh coffee, the kettle hissed again, same sound as always. But it didn't feel lonely now. The house smelled of rain and iron and something almost tender. And as the sun reached the button, it glowed once more, like a small moon forgiving the earth beneath it. Evening settled thick and amber, the kind that turned every object to memory before dark could claim it. The ranch steamed with the day's rain, earth breathing out its ache. Calder stood by the porch rail, watching the last of the puddles shrink into dust, a cup cooling in his hand. Inside, Lena moved slow through the rooms, gathering what the storm had left unbroken. A few dry rags, the needle box, a clean plate for morning. Every sound she made was small but certain, like the sounds of a life returning to itself. When she came to the window, she saw him standing there, still, broad-shouldered, the lamplight behind him haloing his outline. He looked less like a man keeping watch and more like a man deciding whether to let go. That night the wind shifted north again, colder now, carrying scent of far pines and wet ash. Calder was up late, mending a halter by lantern, when the glass rattled. Not from wind this time, but from something looser, lonelier. He found her in the hall, barefoot, shawl around her shoulders, the lamplight spilling down her arm. "The window," she said softly. "It's coming apart again. I can hear it chattering." He brought the lamp, and together they watched the pane tremble in its frame, the night air sighing through the crack. "Got no cloth thick enough to stop it," he murmured. She hesitated, then lifted the calico scrap she'd saved, the one torn from the vanished dress. "Maybe this'll do." He stared at it. "You'd use that?" She nodded. It was never meant to stay a ghost. And before he could protest, she pressed the small strip into the sash, folding it tight so the glass went still. The lamplight caught the pattern, faint flowers in blue and red, and, for an instant, it looked like the window was breathing. Calder stepped back. "You shouldn't have wasted it." She looked up. "It's not wasted. It's working." He studied the calm pane, the way the wind passed over it now without voice. "Maybe so," he said. Lena turned, her face half in shadow. "Some things are meant to stay broken," she said, "and some things just need a place to belong." Her words hung there, soft and heavy. He wanted to answer, but the right words hadn't been made yet. The lamp guttered. He reached out to steady it, but she caught his wrist instead. The gesture surprised them both. Her hand small and sure, his rough, trembling. "You'll catch cold," he said. She smiled. "We've both caught worse." He could have pulled away. He didn't. Outside, a coyote called across the flats. A single long cry, fading like a question that never expects an answer. Later, he found her asleep by the stove, blanket over her knees, the empty cup beside her. The matchbox lay on the table, the pearl button gleaming faintly in the lamplight. He picked it up, turned it once, then set it in her palm. Her fingers closed around it instinctively, and he whispered, not to wake her, but to make sure the truth had sound, "You can keep it now." The house made no protest. He stepped outside into the night. The air smelled clean, alive. The stars were wide apart and cold, each one a nail holding heaven together. He walked to the edge of the porch, looked toward the black line of the creek bed, now full again, whispering low through the grass. The world had opened a little. He thought of the woman who once wore the dress, of the woman sleeping inside, and of the small piece of cloth holding back the wind. Somehow, it all felt part of the same mercy. When he came back in, the lamp had gone out. Only the moon remained, washing the room in silver. Lena stirred, half awake. "You all right, Mr. Rook?" He paused by the doorway. "I reckon I am." "Then go on and rest," she murmured. He wanted to say stay, but the word caught on his tongue. Instead, he nodded and stood there a moment longer, watching the moonlight on her hair, the faint rise and fall of her breath. The cracked matchbox gleamed from her open hand. And somewhere deep in the walls, the wind moved again, not cold this time, not cruel, but gentle, as if testing whether the house could still hold warmth. By dawn, the house had gone gray with quiet. A fog lay low over the flats, turning the corral posts into ghosts. Calder stepped out to meet it, coat collar high, boots sinking into the wet ground. Somewhere out in the mist a cow lowed once, thin and uncertain. The air tasted of rain gone to memory. He carried the pail to the well, cranked the handle slow, and heard the rope groan. Water came, clean, cold, the bucket fuller than it had been in months. He lifted it, smiling a little despite himself, and stood listening to the wind that no longer howled. When he came back inside, Lena was gone. The chair she'd slept in was empty, blanket folded neat. The matchbox sat on the table, open, the button missing. For a moment he thought she'd taken it for good, and the thought cut and healed him in the same breath. Then he saw the note, a scrap torn from a feed sack, written in the small, deliberate letters of someone not used to paper. Going to look for the dress. Couldn't leave it out there alone. He folded the note once, twice, slid it into his pocket, and went after her. The fog thickened toward the draw. The land made no sound but water dropping from the cottonwoods. He followed the faint path where storm runoff had cut a shallow stream, calling her name low so as not to lose it in the mist. Lena. No answer. Only the slow suck of mud under his boots. When he reached the fence line, he found the calico, or what was left of it, tangled in mesquite. The cloth was torn thin as breath. Colors bled to ghost. He lifted it gently, half afraid it would dissolve. Beyond the fence he saw her, kneeling in the grass, skirts soaked, hands clawing through the wet earth. "Lena," he called, "come back to the house." She turned, face streaked with rain and tears alike. "It's here somewhere. The button rolled when the storm took it. I can feel it." He knelt beside her, tried to take her wrist. "Leave it be." She shook her head. "You said it was the last piece of her. I can't leave it lying in the dirt." "It was," he said softly, "until now." For a long while they stayed like that. Two figures bowed in the wet field, searching. Then, just as he was about to pull her to her feet, the sun broke through the fog. Light spilled over the ground, and there, half buried beside a tuft of sage, something caught it. A glint, a whisper of silver. Lena reached first, scooped it from the mud. The pearl button, still cracked, the fracture dark with soil. She laughed, a small, incredulous sound, and set it in his palm. Calder closed his hand around it, feeling the grit and the chill. Then he pressed it back into hers. "You found it," he said. "It's yours to keep." Her breath hitched. "I only meant to bring it home." He looked around at the brightening land, at the steam rising from the wet grass. "You already did." They walked back in silence, the calico scrap draped over her arm. By the time the house came into view, the fog had lifted completely. The porch glistened, every board shining like something newly washed of sorrow. Inside, she rinsed the button clean and set it on the windowsill to dry. Calder poured water into the kettle and listened to it hiss over the fire. The sound filled the kitchen the way rain once had. When she turned to speak, he was already watching her. "You'll be leaving soon," he said. She hesitated. "There's other work west of here. People need hands." He nodded slowly. "Then promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Don't let the wind tell your story for you." Her eyes shone. "I won't." He smiled, a small, sad curve of mouth, and looked at the window. The pearl button gleamed in the sunlight, whole in its brokenness. That night, long after she'd gone to bed, he sat alone on the porch. The calico scrap hung from the line again, fluttering gentle in the breeze. He thought of the storm, of her bent in the rain searching, of the quiet hand that had steadied his heart. He whispered her name once, not as prayer this time, but as thanks. The wind carried it off across the flats, not to lose it, but to keep it moving. The morning rose slow and pale, as if unsure it was welcome. A thin mist lay in the hollows, the kind that fades when touched. The ranch held its breath. Even the roosters waited. Calder woke before light, the habit of a life built on early hours and empty beds. He brewed coffee, listening to the small sigh of the stove. When he turned toward the window, the sun was spilling through, and there, catching that light, the pearl button gleamed on the sill, its cracked heart full of gold. He stood there for a long time. Then he smiled. Lena came in from the porch, hair still damp from washing, her dress clean but plain. "Morning, Mr. Rook," she said, soft. He nodded. "The well's running full." "I heard." She poured 2 cups, set one before him the way a wife might, though neither of them mistook it for that. It was simpler, a kindness shared between the living. They drank in quiet. Outside, the cattle moved slow across the greening field. The world had remembered how to breathe again. After breakfast, she gathered her things, the thread tin, the folded scraps of cloth, the few coins he'd pressed into her hand. "You sure you don't want me to finish the curtains?" she asked. He nodded toward the window. "You already did." She followed his gaze. The torn hem from the vanished calico had been sewn into the curtain's edge, its faint flowers bright against the plain weave. The light shone through it, warm and steady. "That bit of her belongs here," he said. "The rest belongs to the wind." Lena's eyes softened. "And where do I belong?" He looked at her a long time, then said, "Wherever you find peace that doesn't ask for payment." She smiled, and something eased between them. Not love, not loss, but the quiet after both. When she stepped out onto the porch, the wind lifted her hair, and for an instant it carried the faint tune she used to hum. He thought it was only memory, until she began humming again, low, steady, the sound threading through morning light. He leaned against the post, watching her cross the yard toward the road. The sky had turned to brass and silver. The earth smelled of wet sage. Her figure grew smaller until it was just another color in the land. Inside, he tidied the kitchen. He placed the matchbox on the shelf beside the salt tin, the way he'd promised himself, not sacred anymore, just ordinary. When he closed the lid, it clicked softly, no longer like a prayer but like a heartbeat found again. The room felt whole. By noon, the sun stood high and the heat began to rise, shimmering above the fence line. Calder went out to the well, turned the handle, and water came clear and cold. He let it run over his hands, over the dirt that had been there too long. He thought of her then, her voice, her patience, her way of fixing things without asking whether they were worth saving. He realized the house no longer smelled of dust and loss, but of soap, coffee, and something that might one day be hope. When he went back in, the curtain moved gently in the breeze. The calico edge fluttered like a living thing, scattering light over the walls. He sat by the window, watching the air dance through that strip of color, and it felt like sitting beside both women at once, one gone, one forgiven, and himself among them, quiet and alive. Outside, a meadowlark sang from the fence post, its voice clear against the sky. Calder lifted his eyes toward it, then toward the horizon where dust and light met like equal halves of a single truth. He whispered, not to anyone, just to the day, "She's home." And as he said it, he wasn't sure if he meant his wife, the seamstress, or the part of himself that had been wandering. It didn't matter. The words were enough. The wind moved through the yard, stirring the curtain. It brushed the edge of the cracked pearl button, and for a moment it shone as if whole again. The world was quiet, and the quiet was kind.